appreciate you being here.
Okay, thank you, Paul McNeill. Good afternoon, Pakalagifsi. My name is Robin Mongoyak. I'm going on my 46th year this year of 2016. Not a youngin' anymore. I wish I still was. I kind of sort of is in a way. I still like to look at myself as being young. I've always been intrigued with storytelling all my life, ever since I can remember. That's one of the real fascinations of my life living in the Arctic. It's living through storytelling. Storytelling to the Inupiat people is something like reading books or writing memoirs or telling about your past and telling about your history of people who living in the present never got to know or never got to feel of what it was really like to live back then. It's really intriguing to me that storytelling in the Inupiat way is very unique and very defined. A lot of people tell the similar stories. A lot of people interpret them in very different ways. Um, I grew up with an Inupiat family. I'm very fortunate. I was an adopted child, but my grandparents, my paternal and maternal grandfather and grandmother adopted me into their family. My biological mother, whom I always knew as my sister, was really my mom, and she also was a big benefit of my life in learning how to read and speak Iñupiat.
Same thing happened to Jack Nicholson.
Pretty much so, I think.
Yeah.
I only know him as an actor, so I kind of admire that guy too very much. He's got a lot of good movies, Western movies, before he made any other movies like Batman and so forth. I like to listen to the lot stories whenever I can. I grew up hunting and camping with my mom and dad, especially growing up as a youngster. We would always follow the seasons. We would follow winter, spring, summer, and fall. This time of the year, way before everything like this modern times we're living. I remember my father used to bring us out, way out here somewhere toward the east, up on into the Dease Inlet and take us ice fishing. Not for the little tomcats you get over here in the Arctic Ocean, but for a little bit bigger fish like smelts like the people of Wainwright catch. But I only remember that real vaguely when I was a little boy, maybe not even 3 years old. But I remember it was real bright day like this, windy like it is, cold, but he would take us out maybe a 2 or 3 hour drive, and then he would find a crack in the ice and he would check it out to see if there's fish in it, and if he caught more than 2 or 3 fish, then we would sit there for maybe 4 to 6 hours before finally driving back to Barrow for the day or for the evening. We never camped out there. We only spent maybe 6 hours at the most out there fishing. Sometimes we caught fish, sometimes we didn't catch fish, but it was something that my dad always liked doing for us. He always mentioned to us, no matter how much your life is going to get easier for you, you should always remember to live the past, learn the history of our elders and ancestors, because you never know if those days might ever come back to you and you have to live them once again. Which is, I don't know, to me is ironic and very pessimistic sometimes, because the way we're living is kind of for the better. You know, it's getting easier, even though it's economically hard. But when you think about the way they lived in the past, you know, they may not have economically, you know, substandards like we do now, but they lived a very, very normal and, you know, chill life, if you want to use that word. I mean, they had a lot of worries. They had a lot of things like we still have today, but they lived it as simple as they simply can. They always said, as long as you had a roof over your head, you had clothing on your body, you had food to eat and water to drink, you can survive anywhere and anywhere, even in the harshest conditions that we live up here. Anywhere down south, anywhere up north, anywhere east or west, wherever the roads cross, you could live. Thank you for inviting me over here to your Iñupiat storytelling class. I was pretty intrigued and excited to hear that I was recommended to come and speak with you guys. I listen to a lot of the Iñupiat stories on the radio hour, Monday through Friday from 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock. Sometimes they cut them short, sometimes they go all the way till 6 to 7. They're all in Iñupiat. They speak in Eskimo. They talk about all the creations that we never got to hear when we were kids because of our communities being raised through Christianity. Christianity isn't a bad thing when you think about it because it helped the Inupiat people learn to live with the outside world. When the outside world came to Barrow or anywhere along the Arctic coast of Alaska, the Inupiat were welcoming. A lot of them were warlike people. A lot of people welcomed them. A lot of people didn't welcome them. And whomever welcomed them, they offered them their house, they offered them their food, they offered them their families. And a lot of the people that came and didn't know our cultural way of life took advantage of it. They turned us around. They made us feel like we were living upside down because we were more inviting than we were pushing anybody away. And we looked forward to their coming and visitations because it was something to always look forward to after living in this kind of a harsh condition throughout the dark months between October and January. And then you got whaling coming up in the springtime, and then you got things to look forward to in the summertime, and then you got people that are coming in by big ships in the fall time. So there was always something to always look forward to. Iñupiat storytelling to me is kind of like storytelling in fairy tales sometimes, but these are real actual events. Some of them they call folklore, some of them they call science fiction. There's two types of Iñupiat stories that I know about, and that's called Kolektot and Unipgak. Kolektot are stories that are told of experiences, people's experiences that they went out onto the country and they learned by mistake and by failure, but then they fixed it all up. And then when they brought it back, they would tell about it in the Karigis. The Karigis is a gathering place a long time ago before these modern days of times we are living. In the small communities, a Karigi was a place where all the men and all the young people gathered, whether they were doing something with construction or doing something with learning how to do this or learning how to do that, but a lot of it was telling stories and experiences of people's travels and beyond. They would always have a place to talk about these stories. People would listen to them that never gone out and ventured themselves, but they would always say, if you go out and venture out there, you're going to know exactly what I'm telling you because it's going to help you out there. Whether you survive it or you don't survive it, it'll help you. These are the mistakes that we learn, and these are the knowledge that we gain from those experiences that we made as we ventured out into the unknown. Kolektot is like storytelling, like like somebody goes from one community to another. Like say, back in the day, there were people who used to go to the village of Wainwright. It would take them 2 to 3 days to travel sometimes, but then they would make it within that time frame, and then they would always go to a family or a relative's dwelling place, and there they would be greeted with open arms and salutations and everything, and they would tell stories about their experiences between here and there, what they encountered, what they saw, what they did. Sometimes they put them in Eskimo dancing. That's how Eskimo dancing became such a very vital way of life in the Inupiat way. We demonstrate our dancing through the stories that we observe, through the stories that we experience, and we teach them to other people. Like say, if I was a visitor in another village that I went to visit for a short time, they were going to tell me your song, tell me your dance. I want to know your story. So you come up with a song and you dance it in front of them, and you sing it in front of them, and you're using your emotions to describe the dance that you're telling them as a story. And sometimes you make them happy, sometimes you make them emotionally sad, sometimes you give them the greatest experience of their life just by telling them the stories and the songs that you present to them. It's a way of respect. You have to respect each and every different community that you come into. A long time ago, people like you guys were talking about the 1978 Elders and Youth Conference. That was one of the most important times of our cultural life because we gathered a lot of the Iñupiat elders from all the outlying villages of the North Slope, and we brought them into one building and we interviewed each and every one of them, and we asked them, what do you think about your history, your past, and why did we became who we are to this present day? A lot of them used to say community started off in the east, like around Point Hope. They grew into enormous populations, and from their enormous populations, they spread it out into different localities, into smaller subdivisions, into smaller groups of villages. And then they grew all from the east side, and then they started, from the west side, and then they started coming in slowly toward the east. Lots of good stories they have, and a lot of good stories we have, and then we collaborated with one another. We similarize them, and some of them make sense, some of them don't make sense, some of them are different than the others, which is really, really intriguing to listen to. A lot of stories I like to listen to are stories about Barrow and about Nuvuk. Nuvuk is the point where a lot of the Inupiat people of this area lived before, the highest concentrated population. Barrow and anywhere in between Barrow and Nunavak, they were just hunting places, small little settlements, maybe family-sized settlements that used to live up and around here. So Nuvuk was a real big population of people that lived here once upon a time, and they all slowly moved over here to the Barrow side when this fur trading company came along the shores and built a trading post for, people to go and barter and trade whatever they might have. It's really interesting about the stories they tell. People like Pete Suvalek, people like Joe Sakavayangak, Justice McKenna, people from Wainwright, people from Point Hope, people from Anaktuvuk, like I said, Justice McKenna, Elijah Kakinya, those kind of people. They told about stories about their childhood, about their youth, about the histories that they experienced when they were growing up, about the stuff that they were taught by their parents. Iñupiat always told stories through time immemorial. You got to understand that Iñupiat people lived way, way before 1,000 years ago. They may have lived even, 10,000 years ago, because that's how far back our history goes. Like when they talk about this lady who was known as the sea goddess, her name was Sikanarina, that we know her as an Iñupiat name up here in the North Slope. A lot of the people on the east side of Barrow, like from Tuktoyak to Aklavik and Inuvik, and then beyond there to Greenland and all the other Inuvialuit communities in Canada, they known her as Nuleyuk, or Ikaluguruak, the lady who lives in the ocean. This lady that we talk about originated from the North Slope. It originated from the Iñupiat. Iñupiat, when you think about the word Iñupiat, Iñu means inside of you. You breathe it out. That's your soul. That's your essence of life. Iñupiat meaning real people. We always been told that since time immemorial, we were the first people in this world. We are the people who created the people of this world. That is our history. This may have happened millennia times, but it was told over and over. As similarly as possible, it could be told. Maybe some people had different interpretations of the story, but it was always told in a similar fashion. This lady lived between here and Wainwright, and her name was Sigrarina. She was a real prominent lady, real bachelorette type. She was strong. She was well coordinated. She just lived with her mother and father, but she always had a real good companion, always by her side, and it was such a companion like men always call their best friends. It was a dog. All kinds of people had dogs growing up, but they had mushing dogs. They never had dogs as pets, but this lady, Sigrarina, had a dog as a pet. This dog followed her everywhere she went. Whenever she go hunting, she learned how to hunt at an early age through her father, because her father never had boys. He just had her. There was just the father, the mother, and her. So she learned really quick growing up, learning how to hunt small games and small animals with her father. And she was presented a dog when she was a young girl. And this dog was unlike any other dog. It was a real passionate dog, real close-knit dog, like maybe a half-wolf dog. And those are the kind of dogs that they learn to adapt with people, because they have a strong essence themselves when it comes to wolf packs and stuff like that. So this dog was real special to her. It walked and followed her everywhere she went. It even slept outside of her tent every time they went to sleep at night. So this dog was real close to her. And there was a time in her life when she became of age where she was eligible to marry any one of the men in the village, the young men, the young successful hunting men. But she was not ever interested. She was one of those strong tomboy type individuals. She wasn't looking for somebody to marry. She wasn't looking for somebody to have a partner with for the rest of her life. She was content. She was strong. She was able. But the other men in the village were confused. They were wondering why she didn't like them, why she didn't want to court with them, why she didn't want to marry any one of them. Even the young men's wives' fathers were kind of getting angry. They were feeling disrespected. But this lady, she didn't mind them at all. She just went about her business on a daily basis, until one evening when these young men's fathers got together and they went to the shaman of the community and they said, "You got to do something about this. You got to put some kind of spell on this woman, for she is disrespecting the village, and she is disrespecting our sons who are successful hunters, in making her a bride so that they could continue their procreation and lives forward." So these shamans obeyed what these people told them to do. So they conjured up some kind of ritual to put a spell on this lady. And one evening, as this lady was going to her tent to go to sleep for the night, she came into a realistic dream. She felt hypnotized. She felt like she was put on a spell, but she didn't know it. She didn't know how to feel it, but she sure felt like it was a dream that she had never had been in before. So all of a sudden, when she was sleeping, she saw this young, handsome Iñupiat man at the door of her tent. And normally she was not one to invite any men into her tent, because she was never interested in any one of the men. But for some reason, she invited this man in, and he courted with her, and he made her feel passionate and loved and everything else in between. And for the first 3 days, he kept coming in every night, until one fateful day when he no longer showed up, and she was wondering where or whatever happened to that man. Little did she know, a few days later, she started to feel kind of different. She kind of felt like something was not right within her body. And then she went to tell her father what was going on, and her father felt around her tummy and noticed that she was pregnant, and he was kind of baffled himself, and he was uncertain to how this could have happened to her. And she told him that she had a dream of a man coming into her tent, and the first 3 nights they fell in love, and he bedded with her and everything, and then all of a sudden after that she was alone again, and she don't recognize the man in the village. She never knew who this man was, never even got a name of him. But her father immediately thought, oh my goodness, you must have gotten cursed. You must have gotten a spell put on you by our shamans. And back in the day, if you were caught pregnant without a man in your life, that was kind of a sign of shunning. People will shun you. They will throw you out of the village. They will tell you that you cannot have, a baby without a man in your presence. It's taboo, superstitious. So the father and the mother and the sister, the daughter and their dog, they packed up their belongings at night because they were afraid of what the village might do to them. They could stone them, they could hurt them, they could kill them. So they packed up everything that they owned onto the sled and got their dog team ready, and then they just took off in the middle of the night while everybody was asleep, and they started dog mushing from here, or from west of here, from around Wainwright. They just took off east all the way towards the demarcation or the Flagsman Islands that are located east of here. As far away as they could get from the people, they mushed, until they finally came to this area east of here, and it was an island that was just off the coast of the mainland, and they set up a sod house, and they lived there for the remainder of her pregnancy. When she was about to have her child or children, she was pregnant much sooner, and she gave birth much quicker than a normal pregnancy would take. Normally a woman takes 9 months. For her, it took mainly 4 to 6 months before she had childbirth. I don't know if they came out premature or if they came out normal, but she had more than one baby, which was very odd, because most women have one baby, and sometimes they have twins or triplets, but this lady, she had a total of 7 babies. And right away she found out that her father found out that the shamans had cursed her, and they had made her dog turn into some kind of a man in the night and bed with her. I know that sounds very unreal or anything like that, but that's what they did, because that lady loved her dog so much that they made that dog turn into some kind of a human form, and or made her think of it like that, and she ended up having relations with that animal. But when she was near giving birth, she had 3 babies that were supposedly like half dog and half human. They had dog features, they had tails, they had longer tongues, they had pointy ears, and they yelped, and they were very like excited kind of little children, unlike human babies. And 4 of them came out normal, but they were in different colors. They had brown, they had beige, they had darker colors, but they were fair skinned like we are, which was really interesting to say, because they said they were dog children. They were children made from a dog and from a human. And this lady, she was in shock when she had these babies, but women, they change into this passionate being when they have babies. No matter what kind of a baby it is, they will take it and nurture it like as if it is their own. And it was her own babies, even though they were different. So she decided to raise these babies. Her dad was the only provider, so he would always come and feed her and her babies for a very long time. And these babies didn't take very long to grow, like puppies grow fast. These children of hers grew very quick. They didn't take years to grow like we take years to grow. They take more months than, we did in growing. So as time went along, 3 of these babies were very dog-like and 4 of these babies were very human-like. So it was about a total of 7 children that she had at one time. It got to the point where the father was getting worried about people finding out about their children, about the way they looked and about who they may have been conceived by. So he was getting worried and he was getting afraid because there were people coming in from different parts of the territory, and he had to keep them hidden most of the time because he didn't want them to be noticed, or he didn't want any other Inupiat out there to feel afraid of them. So he tried to conjure up some kind of a way to stop feeding them, maybe kill them or let them starve to death. And the mom heard about this, and she told her 3 young dog-like children, saying, "Your grandfather is trying to kill us. When he comes back to feed us again, maybe there's something you guys might want to try to do to him so that you guys don't get killed by him or by the other people that he's going to tell you guys about." And that how became a legend of its own from the people of the Canadian side, because they also heard about these stories.
They call her Sedna over there.
Yeah, Sedna, Nuleyuk. There's a lot of different names that she's being known as, but she's known as the sea goddess. She was equivalent to God of Christianity days back then. We respected her because she was a lady who created all the marine mammals of the Arctic Ocean. She created all the fish, all the clams, and all the other crustaceans of life that lives underneath the sea. She also, with the 4 children that she had, other than the 3 others that totaled her offspring, she set them out in a kayak when they were grown of age. And she said, "Go out into the world and go out and make your living." And we're talking centuries ago, maybe millennia. So this is a real strong legend, real strong folklore that Iñupiat have passed down from time immemorial. And as she sent them out into the world, little did we know that they would come back centuries later. Even though it's hard for you to understand this, that's what the Inupiat believed. When these people came back centuries later, Inupiat still remembered the stories of Nuleyuk, still remembered the stories of Sikaragina. And they were mesmerized, they were startled, they were in shock. They said, "Oh my goodness, Nuleyuk's children have come back." They came back as commercial whalers. They came back as fur traders. They came back as Native Americans that we call Indians, Iktiliks. They came back as people that we know as Asians. Even though they say that we come from Mongolia, I always believe it was the other way around, that Mongolia came from us. Even though we have same features and same cultural aspects in their lives versus our lives, I always feel that our archaeology and our anthropology is a way different form of demonstration in the eyes of historians. They think that everything came from over there in the land of Asia, but I believe that a lot of the life that we live in this world today came from this mainland we called Alaska. Even though it may have been covered in snow and ice, there were still people living along the edges, along the coastlines. living off the marine mammals of the sea. Anyways, this lady, Sikararena, became Nilayuk or became Sedna. She tried to get her father killed by her children, and her father tried to row away in a boat that he was using to get from the mainland to the island, and the daughter, his only daughter, tried to get on the boat with him, but he was so afraid that his daughter was going to capsize the boat on them and both of them would surely drown in the frigid waters that he actually threw her overboard. And as she was clinging onto the edge of the boat, he decapitated or amputated every one of her fingers, including her arm, to the point where she couldn't no longer hold on to the boat and she fell to the bottom of the sea and drowned. And from that time, all the fingers that were cut off her hands, all the knuckles, all the wrists, and even the arm, all grew into these animals and these mammals. They were born of the seal, the bearded seal, the walrus, the whale, the fish. Everything that you hunt in the ocean, she created as she was falling to the bottom of the sea. So every time when people hunt in the ocean, they have to always respect who this lady was and how she came to be, because she is in control of all life, including the weather we call Sila. If we don't follow life's directions the way we were told, then she would get angry and she would get miserable and she would make the wind blow and it would make animals stay away from these sites where people used to go hunt them for. And sometimes people wouldn't hunt animals for 2 to 3 weeks, maybe even longer, because the wind was too cold or the weather was too bad. And they always said that Sikararina or Nilayuk or Sedna was the reason why all of this is happening. You have to learn to respect her. That's why they had shamans back in the day who were able to transcend into the ocean in spirit form. And she said, and they used to say she had this real long woman-like hair. When it's nice and combed, she's giving life above the surface of the world to live in harmony and people can hunt successfully. But if her hair is all messy and hard to comb, that means she's in a real miserable mood and she's not going to give you the animals that are there for you to hunt easy. You're going to starve. You're going to feel like there's nothing going on for the next 3-4 days. So they always summoned the shaman, an angakko. There, he would chant and he would make himself leave his body and his spirit would go into the ocean and go visit this Nilayuk lady underneath the ocean, and she would greet him and he would try to court with her, not necessarily court with her, but try to please her, and she would try to keep him away from coming near her, but he would always use his charm, he would always use his elegance, he would use his respect in nature to get closer to her. And if she allowed him, he would be able to comb his hair from all the tangly mess that she was getting herself into, and she would comb it into a nice fine lather. And once that happened, the weather would calm down, the animals would be abundant again, and life would go as it normally should in order to be surviving in this kind of harsh conditions.
This is actually in a book called Spirit Wrestler, Sedna and Nanoko.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories about Sedna. I mean, it's worldwide, practically on a circumpolar level. Everybody from the east of Quebec, where the Inuit or the We never got to talk about it because of our Christianity was too strong in the north. When the missionaries came to Barrow, or when they came along the coastlines of the Arctic coast, Iñupiat had ceremonial songs. They had traditional ways of life. When they hunted animals, they respected these animals they hunted because they believed that these animals gave themselves up for the Iñupiat to live. So they had to respect these animals. They said these animals have spirits. They have tunarak. The interpretation of tunarak today we know as the devil. But in the historical times of the Iñupiat, tunarak meant a helping spirit. These animals had helping spirits. They weren't just animals. They didn't know anything about the land, but they knew everything about the land. They knew everything about the people. They even spoke to people back in the day before people really got to know more about what life is like today. And it's just it brings in the creativity of your mind when you hear about these stories about the way they thought. I've really lost. My mind is getting a mental block, but I can assure you I have a dozen more stories to tell, and I'm jumbling these all up. I was trying to think of how I could present to you guys a real good speech, but there's so many things in my mind that I could tell you guys about. It's just too exciting sometimes. Like you said, you know, they consider it legendary. They consider it folklore, unipka. But when you think about it, the Inupiat people said these were actual true events. These were actually events that really happened in time many years ago.
Are there any other deities that you know of?
There's lots of deities. Shamanism isn't just about good and evil. Shamanism is something that describes one way or another, like a doctor, a psychiatrist, a masseuse, somebody who can get into the spirit realm, somebody who can talk to the spirit world. You know, it's almost like, yeah, a lot of different type of specialties. But the way the missionaries saw it when they first came, they saw scariness, they saw realness, they saw that, you know, we need to transform these people into a different form of, you know, life in order for them to learn to get colonized or something like that. When the Inupiat people danced their ceremonial songs, they really got into it theatrically. I mean, they got into it. They got into chanting more or less than how you would want to observe. They were scary. They were real. They didn't take it as a demonstration. They took it as a real thing that was to happen in order for them to be successful again. Like maybe when Martha Stackhouse was here last week when she talked about Kalukak or the eagle mother. Back in them days, those animals, they can speak to you and you can learn from them. The Inupiat people learned a lot of the things from the animals, and through observations of life in the Arctic, they learned how to hunt the seal with the polar bear. They learned how to hunt animals by observing other animals. You know, they learn how to store food, like the fox stores food in the wintertime. It's amazing if you see an Arctic fox during October through January. He's going to catch as many lemmings as it possibly can, but he won't eat them right away. He'll catch them and then he'll dig a little storage place for it, and then he'll bury it. And if you ever go out there every day like I did one time, you're going to see lots of places where one fox buried over 100 lemmings under the snow. And then when times of starvation or something comes its way, he comes back and he digs them up. Whether it be in the springtime or even in the summertime, he'll come back to pick them up. He won't eat them up right away. And that's how Iñupiat learn, through animals, observations, and their way of life. Whenever a successful man went out to go hunting, if they were successful in catching a wolverine or a wolf, something real predatory, very dangerous, they would come back and they would rest for a number of days so that they can give that animal spirit some time to move from its body into the spirit world. Because if they didn't give it any time to move away from its body into the spirit world, then bad things would happen to that hunter. He would probably not be so successful when he go back out hunting again. You know, those kind of things, superstitious and taboo, was real strong, and it probably still is very strong to this day. My mom and dad grew up very devout Christians. I went to church my whole life, growing up all the way up until I was about 14 years of age. I knew nothing about the outside world, but I always heard stories about what it was like. And the only other stories I ever heard about the outside world were biblical. So I never knew anything about life between the biblical side and the Iñupiat side, because biblically I would hear them in church about Jerusalem and all those other places, and that's all I ever thought in my mind. And then when we come home from church, they would talk about Iñupiat living in the past, living under subterranean sod houses, living in apoyaks called snow igloos, people living off the ocean and everything, how they would make seal nets underneath the ice this time of the year. And I used to always have a fascination because it opened a window of imagination to me and how I could interpret it and how I could see it. And you could listen for hours because my dad and his friends would talk about these stories that I never ever thought I would ever get to understand or ever get to experience, but they were real stories about their lives, about the way the Iñupiat used to live. They talked about stories like the 10-legged polar bear. Even to this very day, the scientists and the biologists think that it was folklore. They say, how in the world can anybody ever say there was ever a 10-legged polar bear? The Iñupiat people knew. The Iñupiat people said there really was a 10-legged polar bear. It was called a Kupkorak. And this Kupkorak lived out in the point, somewhere in the ocean. And if you think about it, we're talking at least 500-600 years ago. The ocean was a real jumbled up ice pack. We don't see open leads as close as we do see them now, but back in the day, an open lead would never hardly open up even in the wintertime. You would never hardly see a pool of water anywhere near the coastline. Sometimes they had to walk 10 miles, maybe even 20, 25 miles at times just to go find a crack in the ice. Back in the day, people used to fish for a living. They go find a crack in the ice and they go fishing. And then as time evolved forward, people started from fishing to hunting seals. Through the observation of other animals, they learned. And we call these little pools of ice in between jumbled up ice called nirayuks. They're pools of water that open up somehow and gives you an oasis of opportunity to go there and fish for fish, or you could fish for crabs, or you could fish for seals or whatever whales that may have been around there at that time. And when you think about it, life in their time was way different than life that we're experiencing today, but very similar in some aspects. they may have had a harder way of living, but to them it was as simple it can be. I mean, they probably, you know, didn't have to worry about washing themselves on a daily basis, or they didn't have to worry about being clean all the time, because that was their way of staying away from sickness and unhealthiness. They kept that bacteria within themselves, so they wouldn't get sick, so they wouldn't be too unimmune to certain bacteria that may come and invade the body and make you weak or susceptible to diseases and stuff like that. But a lot of life changed in the 40s when missionaries started to turn us around. I always believed that if we had our own real way of life, we would be living in subterranean engineering type homes. You know, like this building wouldn't be on top of the surface of the land sitting on pilings, but yet we would probably have dug a trench or a foundation like they do with basements in the lower 48, but instead of that, our houses would be halfway up above the surface of the land, and we would be living more or less down in the subterranean world of our tundra. You never know. That's just my thought and imagination of how I think life would have been different if we had our own way, if we were really accustomed to the Western way of civilization. Lots of Inupiat stories tell about like a man, a real successful man living in Nuvuk. He was going out into the ice to go fishing, and they had already made this main trail to where the ice opened up and they was able to go fishing. Lots of people from the village of Nuvuk would use this on a daily basis. But this one successful hunter came out one day and he noticed another set of tracks going in a different direction from the main trail, so he followed these tracks and they came to a real big iceberg, and he went around the iceberg and he saw these two men, or this man and this lady, and they were chanting, and he recognized who them to be, and he said those were the shamans of the village. And he startled upon them and he said, "What are you guys doing?" And they got startled when that man came to them, and they didn't know what to say. They were flabbergasted, they were speechless, but he knew they were doing something wrong because he was listening to them for a while before they were even startled by his presence. He noticed that you get this predominant weather in the wintertime, north to northeast, and that keeps the open leads open. But then again, when the weather changes around, you get the west to northeast, the west to northwest, and then it closes up the leads. These shamans were trying to chant a song to turn the weather around so that the oceans can close up and fishing wouldn't be so abundantly possible. And he was wondering why they were doing that. I guess they had some kind of difference within the community leader of the village, and they were trying to do something negatively wrong, hoping that nobody was going to get any fish that day, that week, or that month. So this man said, "I'm going to go and tell the people of the village what you guys are doing and what you guys are trying to do." And they got real frightened, because back in the day, you had to come up to the people that supervised the community. You had to tell them what you did wrong, and if you did something very wrong, they would shun you. They would expel you from their village. They would kill you. They didn't want any of that to happen, so they said to this real successful hunting man, they said, "If you don't tell about us being here and about what we were doing, we'll grant you anything you want, anything." And this successful man was like, he had a wife, but his wife and him, they couldn't bear children. They tried for many times and they couldn't get pregnant, and she couldn't have baby. So he said, "Well, if you think you can make me and my wife have a baby, then my secret shall remain with me, and I will not tell anybody about your guys' foolish act that you guys were trying to put upon the village. The shamans were, very strong people in those days. So they accepted his offer. They said, we will give you a baby, but you must do this for us. When the springtime comes and the tundra is starting to show on the surface of the ground, as it melts, when you see the snow melt on the mounds of the tundra, then you should venture out there somewhere, and you should go and try to find yourself a dead weasel. And he listened to what they told him to do, and he went out there into the tundra, and he looked around all these mounts, like sometime in April and May, when the snow is starting to melt and you can see the surface of the tundra patches everywhere. He walked around and looked around, and he couldn't find one for a long time. And finally, before summer, and there was still snow on top of the ground, he finally came across a dead weasel. The shamans thought he was never going to find it, They were hoping that he was never going to find it. But he was so diligent that he wanted a child, and that he wanted to bear children, that he was going to go out there to look, no matter how hard it was for him to try to find what he was out there looking for. And reluctantly, fortunately, he found a dead weasel. And he got that weasel, and he brought it back to the shamans, and they were in shock. They couldn't believe he actually found the weasel, but they had to uphold their word about him wanting a child. So they said, okay, we're going to conjure up a chanting, and we're going to do something with this weasel in our little igloo, but you must go back to your wife and stay with her for the night. By the next morning, your wife shall be pregnant, and you guys will have a boy. They already had predicted this. And no matter how many times they tried to have a baby, they couldn't have a baby. Up until that one night, they did some chanting, and they did some, ritualizing. You know how shamans work, their powers. And from that dead weasel, they were able to bring about its spirit and transform it somehow and bring it into the woman that successful hunter had as his wife. And sure enough, within a few days after the day following the ceremonial chanting that they brought on this weasel, this lady started to feel different, and she noticed she was pregnant. And then 9 months came around, and she had a baby boy. And the whole village, they were shocked. They were in disbelief, because they knew he tried for a long time to have babies, and he couldn't have babies. And finally he had a baby, and he was happy. And from then on, he had another baby, and maybe another baby. So he must have had 3 babies, all in different years. But after the first one, he was successful in having babies again. But they named this baby something like Okhrok, because he was made from shamanism. And this baby grew up to be real prominent, real successful. And they wore necklace charms back in the day called Mongoyaks. Mongoyaks were like a rabbit's foot. Anyways, this child that they brought up had an Mongoyak of a weasel, like a necklace. And the head of the village of Nuvuk, the big strong men with the powerful shamans, they didn't like what happened. They didn't like how this person was created. So they abolished his family and abolished his son from Nuvuk, and they told him to move south around here in the Barrow area we call Okoksi, right over there by the dry cleaners. And there he lived for a very long time, but he was real prominent. He was real successful. He did a lot of hunting, and he also was collaborative with the whaling people that used to come here for commercial whaling. So he was able to get things from the commercial whalers. Unlike the people of Nuvuk, they had still traditional hunting tools and hunting equipment, but he could get guns and he could get knives made of steel and get black powder. And for a long time they were, I think, jealous. So they would always try to conjure up some way to go and kill this guy, but all the time they would try to come to kill him, he was always hiding under the ground because he was made from a weasel. He knew how to hide from people. So they would wait and wait, but he would never come out, only during nights and during times when he knew it was safe to come out, and he would come out. So those are the type of stories that I remember and I listen to every time I try to hear Iñupiat stories being told on the radio hour. They're real good, interesting stories. How Raven brought the light, how the sea goddess became a magnificent lady of the Iñupiat world, how the 10-legged polar bear. They're all real interesting stories. They're all based on facts, and they're all based up from around this area where they spread it west and they spread it east. When Nuleayuk's children came back, they came back some as Itkalek people, they came back some as black people, they came back some as Caucasian people, and they came back some as Asian people. Those were the 4 different kind of people that came back. And it was true that it's what the legend says, that we were the people who brought them out, and they were going to come back tenfold every time. Some of the movies that you want to watch that kind of makes sense. Has any one of you ever watched White Dawn? Yeah. You know, and if you can understand the Iñupiat or the Inuvialuit language that they use, it makes sense. Or has any one of you ever watched the Nextalik people, the Canadian Baffin Islands, the archipelagos? No. Real good film to watch. I think they might even have them here in the library. They're called Netzilik people, the Inuit people that lived the Inuit way of life before the assimilation of westernized culture coming up here to transform us into a different way of living. They have good narrations, you know, along with the movie, kind of like storytelling, and it really brings you back to their realm of life and makes you imagine how it could have been if we lived that life instead of living this life. And they talk about Nuleayuk, they talk about all kinds of deities. There wasn't very many deities back in the day, but the lady Nuleayuk, she controlled the weather, Silla. She controlled everything, the weather and its elements, the fog, the rain, the wind, the snow. She controlled all the mammals of the ocean. She was really revered as a real goddess. Even shamans used to worship her. Okay, whole different subject. Even on Kholekduat, on science fiction and fiction stories and stories of experience, they would talk about things like wolves. I'm very fascinated with wolves because of the stories that I heard as I listened to these Iñupiat storytellers. They said wolves, as compassionate as they can be as a family pack, they can also be very ferocious and mean, especially when they're hungry and when they grow into super packs and when they get rabies. A long time ago, Iñupiat people had no guns with gunpowder or black powder. They had bows and arrows, they had spears, and they had those atlas that can throw farther than your arm can throw. But that wasn't always sufficiently enough when you came across a super pack of wolves. Wolves, long time ago, when they would grow to many as 20 to 30, they would learn to go and hunt human beings. They weren't just looking out there for caribous and other wild animals to hunt, but they learned how to hunt human beings. There was a lot of people living in this land before our time. Right now, we're the highest population in Barrow, about 4,000. Back in the times of the Iñupiat, there was tens of thousands. We're talking 7,000 people in different parts of the settlements that we are living in now. Especially in the inland countries, there was mega populations, subpopulations of family settlements living in all different parts of the regions. Sometimes a big super pack of wolves would go looking for people because they learn how to kill people, they learn how to hunt people, they learn how to eat people. Sometimes you would have a small family of 10 or 12 people, maybe two families living side by side with one another, living in the wintertime. And then suddenly, out of the horizon comes this pack of wolves fanned out like this, and they're coming towards your camp. And sometimes they come in at night, or sometimes they come in during a blizzard. They always use strategic moments to hunt their prey, and they would sneak up on families, and they would get them at night, or they would get them while they didn't even at least known that they were coming in to get them. These wolves were really knowledgeable. They were real smart. They hunted people. They killed people. They demolished families, and people would tell other people. Survivors would run to another settlement group and tell them of the turmoil that just happened. They said these wolves, they have to be stopped. They have to be killed. They have to be prevented from growing into super packs, because once they get into these super pack populations, they get unstoppable, especially if they know how to kill people. No matter what kind of weapon you try to use upon them, even if you were trying to defend yourself against one wolf, you have 3 other wolves that are surrounding you, and they will all try their best to grab you, bite you, or put you down in any way possible. They've even also said that wolves, when they're real hungry, nothing is able to stop them. They'll go for anything and everything. Another way that makes them really mean and ferocious is when they get rabies. Not just Arctic foxes get rabies, they also run into wolves that get rabies. And when a wolf gets rabies, it's undeniably dangerous, because they will run to a man or a woman or a child, and they will just chomp on that person. Not necessarily kill him, her, or it, but they will bite it enough times to put the rabies poison into the bloodstream of that body, and that body will eventually die within a few days to a week. And there are stories like that that have been told in these Inupiat storytelling hours by these people who observed these events that happened in the past. Life in the old days was hard living. Maybe that's why we look forward to the commercial whalers and fur traders that used to come in the summertime, because they would bring something different. Not only did they bring sugar and tea and coffee and all those other dry good necessities, but they also brought black powder and guns and ammo and, canvases and other things like that that we could use. I mean, the tents that we used in the old days were walrus hide and caribou skins. But when the days of canvas and cloth and calico came, we put away all the skins and got in all those other type of material, because you always had to keep your hides and your skins from decaying. You had to put them away under a frozen ground in the summertime so that you can reuse them in the fall and wintertime. But with canvases and calico, you know the word calico, that's where the Iñupiat term calico came from. We call it calico, they call it calico. You know, we learned to adapt to these new things that we were being presented by the outside settlers. So whether we think of it as being good or bad, it was always just because we were adapting to nature in an evolutionary way of life, I guess you could say. There are very many different shamans in Inupiat history. They're not just two. They're not just bad and good. They're everything else in between. There were people who were doctors. There were people who were psychiatrists, because there was all kinds of things that happened in Inupiat way of life. We had depression. We had suicidal tendencies. We had starvations. We had sicknesses. We had birth defects. We had all kinds of things that happened to us before doctors and nurses and things like that came to our aid and taught us a whole different way of life. People knew exactly what to do with other people. My grandparents came from shamans, but they put those all away when they became Christians because they didn't want it to conflict in their new way of life. My grandmother said she used to put patients inside of a small tent, and before their end of life, she would chant with them all night long, chanting. Sometimes they would get better. Sometimes they would leave that night in what we call death. And then my mom's grandfather, he was a man who can move things around in your body. He can tell where your pancreas was. He could tell you where your kidneys were. He could conjure up your ribs if you had broken them. He could mend your bones back together if you had dislocated them. You know, those were those other type of shamans that they didn't know, you know, like magicians know, like illusionists. There was all different kinds. There was not just the good and the evil. So if you think about shamanism, don't think about, you know, devil worshippers, or don't think about voodooism, because that's just one type of shamanism. You know, there's always a good and there's always a bad. And you always have to try to balance it all out in nature in order to live a harmonious life, no matter how you see it. It took Inupiat a long time to turn over to Christianity because they were too afraid of what they might happen to themselves if they leave their deity and transfer themselves into a different deity. But, you know, I'm really way off my presentation here, so I totally apologize, and if I'm making it any boring, I can try to make it up sometime again in the future. But to conclude all of this, Iñupiat storytelling, really informational. It opens a window of opportunity into your imagination. It brings a lot of things to the mind about how life was like in the past, how life is like in the present, and how life is like going to be in the future. You want to learn to explore your mind. You want to create pictures, just like how you watch TV, like how you read books with pictures in them. Storytelling is passed down verbally in the Inupiat way of life. It was never written language. It was never anything else but storytelling. And it was always through Eskimo dancing, or it was always through experiences of observation in nature. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Like There was a real prominent man living in Barda Island about 100 years ago. He was a chief of his own right in this community. Everybody respected him. He was very knowledgeable. He was very important. When he died, all of a sudden in the ocean, for no apparent reason, he died. Some kind of accident. A raven came to their community. For the first time they had seen a raven. And everybody in that community, they were in shell shock. They were just afraid of what that meant, you know. They thought it was some kind of omen. They said, we haven't seen a raven in almost 10 years. And we see one today after he died. So what they did was they took all that man's clothing off, whatever he was wearing at the time of his death, and they burned it. And then they buried him out in the ocean where he died. No matter how much we believe in today's beliefs, we still always look back in the window of our past and say, whether they were similarly the same or different, we still always have this strong feeling inside of us that if we don't do good, then bad things will come upon us. And if we do bad things, then no good things will happen to us. It's always like that with today's life too. You always have to be careful what you did in the past, because what is going to happen to you in the future is all because of your observations and your teachings and your learnings. That's why it's always good to listen to Iñupiat stories. If you can understand them, that's an A+. If you can have somebody interpret them to you, that's also an A+. But if you try to learn and if you try to just listen, and even if you hear words or phrases and you can kind of understand what they mean, that's still good learning for you. You know, always be curious, always have questions, always listen, and always use your imagination what you're listening to, because it's going to grow you up. It's going to make you feel more complete inside of you. You're never going to have too many wonders as you get older. Instead of becoming the listener, you're going to become the teacher. And these are the things that need to be passed down to other generations of our future comings. So, in all of that, I hope I presented my welcoming speech to you guys in any fashion I could have thought of. Thank you. Kuya Nakpak.
Thanks.
I wonder if you could talk a brief, because we were actually having this conversation in another class that they're in about the term Eskimo. And when I was in Anchorage, there was a 30-minute news special about Alaska Airlines' use of the phrase "our Eskimo," and there's always controversy surrounding the use of that term.
Okay.
I wonder if you could.
Eskimo to me has always been an Inupiat word that identified who we are. I never thought about Eskimo as being a derogatory word up until I got to a certain age in my life and thought, I didn't even know that was a word that we're supposed to be ashamed of being called or being known to be as. We were always known to be Inuit, or in our region we were known as Iñupiat, the real people, the people with a breath of life that comes out of our mouth, Innu. It wasn't until I started looking in the history books and started learning from other historical teachers of the Inuit culture that Eskimo came from a Cree word from before the Civil War days, when the French and English first started to conquer the lands of the Americas. There was people living above the Arctic Circle in the land of snow and ice that the French didn't know about, but they heard of and maybe came across every so often, but not very much, because it was too cold of a place to live or too cold of a place to explore at the time. they spoke with a lot of American Indians known as Cree. And they asked the Cree, who were these people living up there in the land of snow and ice? And the Cree answered to them, they are called the Eskimos. People who eat of raw meat and don't use fire. And when you think about it, the word Eskimo isn't even an English word. It's a Cree word. It means people who eat raw flesh. You know, I don't see anything wrong with that because,
It's
you
not,
know,
it's not particularly on the news.
yeah, it's not particularly on the news, but when you're living on the land of snow and ice, I think it's much better to eat it raw than to have it cooked. I grew up like that. My mom always said, we changed over time. When she was a young lady or a young girl, sometimes you didn't have fire because fire was made with the blubber of the animals that sustained it as fuel to light the fire. Or you had to have 2 flints that you can clash together and form a spark to create the fire. And in the wintertime, you didn't have the twigs or the dry wood to keep all year long to sustain your fire. You have to have the blubber and a little bit of the moss and the fungi that you could use in the seal oil plate to create the fire. So a lot of the food that was eaten in the wintertime was raw. Muktuk was raw. Ilisagvik meat was raw. Seal meat was raw. You know, they didn't hunt abundantly like they should. They hunted on a daily basis what they can eat and what they should eat for that day or for that week. Food was never abundantly hunted because you need to have a cache to store it in. That's why isolets were made. Eskimo came from those people from the east of Saskatchewan, and that's how it became such a main word for describing who we are above the Arctic Circle, the Eskimos. Canadian Inuit still call themselves Inuit. They will not use the word Eskimo. And that's the way I wish we could have learned it ourselves. But when you think about it, in the earliest century of the 1900s, like 1900 to 1940, 1942, 1945, the people of the lower 48 were getting interested into the life and living conditions of the people who lived in Alaska and up in the circumpolar areas. So they created films like Mala, which is called The Eskimo. And they created films like Nanook of the North, which is about a man from Canada who became well known to the Hudson fur traders, you know, the Hudson Bay people who came from the Canadian side to trade with the Inuit for, you know, the commodities that they have back then, the pots and the pans and things like that in nature. So Eskimo was used really favoringly, you know, with the movies like that. There's a lot of different movies. I took Alaska Native films with Ilisagvik like 8 years ago, and we talked a lot about these things, how Eskimo came to be known to us as our identity. I know a lot of people think, why do you guys like to be called Eskimo? I said, because it was just always who we were always called. We like to be known as Iñupiat. We like to be known as Inuit, but we don't like to tell people more than once, like I say about my last name. What's your name? Mongoyak. Excuse me, can you say that again? Mongoyak. How do you spell it? Mongoyak, but it spells Mongoyak. Yeah, that's how you spell it and pronounce it. But I tell you, the Iñupiat way is Mongoyak, M-A-N with a tail, U-Y-A-K. But Englishly speaking, is spelled like this. So it was always hard for me to always redirect it to them over and over again. You know, they say, "What's your nationality? What's your identity?" "I'm Inuit," or "I'm known as Iñupiat." Then they want to know more about it. They want to give you 20 questions, and sometimes you can tell them, but sometimes you just don't want to tell them. That's why the word Eskimo is just so easy and simple for them to identify you and, you know, to make conversation short. That face on the Alaska Airlines is a man from around here. He's an Iñupiat man. Gosh, I used to know what his name was. My auntie Rhoda Pickle says that was her grandfather. He was related to the Kippies. I forgot quite what his name is, but he was a real man of stature. He was a successful man of the community. I was a greeting man with a happy face. You know, he had no quarrels. He had no negative aspects of anybody. That's why the Westerners became fluently well known with him. You know, he was always happy. He was always there for them. You know, he was either their interpreter or he was their teacher in the life of the Arctic conditions and way of life that we lived, that the outside needed to learn. So he became well known. I have real nothing against the word Eskimo, but sometimes I feel that we should have been known as Inuit, or we should have been known as, Iñupiat, because that's who we really are. And that's, I mean, to this day and age, we should already be recognized as that. You know, everybody's got their identities. You know, there's Caucasians, and within Caucasians, you got Irish, you got Italians, you got all those other nationalities that all lived together once upon a time in the East, you know, and they all moved and colonized the West and everything like that. I mean, you got the same thing with American Indians. You got people that are Cherokee, you know, Apache, Navajo. You know, that's the same thing we were supposed to be called, Iñupiat, you know. But it all just derived into one meaning. Either you were Indian or you were Eskimo. And
it's all just classification systems.
Basically like that, yeah, classifications, you know. And a lot of the people that you still come across that never been to Alaska, they still ask you, do you actually fish in your living room, sitting down on a recliner? I mean, that's just so hard to imagine, but that's just the way they think, and it's so funny, you know. Yeah. You know, why do you guys eat blubber? Why do you guys eat so much seal oil? You know, I mean, it's hard to explain to them. It's just our way of life. Just recently, I was at the hospital, and this nurse went to the northwest of Alaska in Nome, and they were doing colonoscopy procedures, and I guess they found out that the Iñupiat person, compared to a Caucasian person, their innards are softer and more tender than that of a Caucasian man or woman, because we eat so much food from the ocean, and it makes our innards more soft or tender, versus a Caucasian man or woman living off of fruits and vegetables. Their intestinal linings are thicker and stronger and can digest much better. You know,
really depends on what type of oxidizer you are when it comes to diet.
Something in that nature, yes. You know, you are what you eat, and you eat what you are. You know, see, we're trying to convert ourselves into the Western way of life, when in fact our genes and our genetics are still the way we have always been. You know, people of the sea, and I see no real difference in that, if you ask me, because they have all the ingredients that you would have, you know, learned to eat when it comes to fruits and vegetables. You know, because they have the vitamin C's, they have the vitamin A's, they have the amino acids, they have everything in their dietary supplements that they eat from the ocean that we eat from them, versus all the animals and plants that they grow and then they produce in their, you know, form of food that they have to survive on. So to me, Eskimo is really not derogatory in my mind. I mean, I know a lot of people would say, why do you like to be called Eskimo? Well, it's because everybody knows what that word is. You know, you don't have to explain to yourself more than that one word. You know, yes.
Robin, I was wondering about seasonal stories and whether or not we have rules about the time of year stories are told. Like Navajo people in the Southwest, where I was living before, after the first thunderstorm of the year, they can't tell certain winter stories. They have to stop. Mm-hmm. It's a really strict rule about only telling those stories in the winter, and they can tell them again next winter. But do you know of any similar guidelines or taboos or rules about the time of year that stories are told, or is that not something we have?
Well, in the days of the gathering place we call the Karigi, lots of stories were told of the seasons. Lots of stories were told of the seasonal changes that were to come and that were to be. There are stories that you have to talk about only during those times, like whaling, for instance. When I was growing up, whaling was not to be talked about, period. Only time whaling was ever to be talked about was during this time of the month, all the way up until it was over in May.
Otherwise you defend the whale.
You're gonna offend the whales, because they always say, no matter, even in the wintertime, between August through January, even though the whales may not be out in the ocean, maybe they might be migrated down south somewhere in the Bering or in the Pacific, they still can hear you. If you talk about whaling, it's the same thing as boasting. It's the same way as bragging. And you shouldn't be boasting and you shouldn't be bragging, because the whales will hear you. And if they hear you, they won't want to give themselves to you. That's why we call it the gift of the whale. When we're hunting the whale, we're not hunting to kill it. We're hunting for its sustenance to give to us so that we can survive another year. Only the harpooner and the whaling captain can talk about the whale, but in strategy, what they can do better come next whaling season, what they can do for the whale that's going to give itself to them. The whaler had to have a really good wife. The wife had to have a real good preparation of her home. She had to be well maintained. She had to have a good kitchen. She had to have a good pots and pans. She had to be well known in the community. She had to be helpful. She had to never say no to nobody. If somebody, even the most weakest person or the most famine person, they had to help them. They had to revive them from their unhealthiness state so that they can learn to live another day. That's why they made the ice cellar, because the ice cellar was considered a home for the whale. The spirit of that whale is not going to come with the body that it presented itself to the whalers, but instead it's going to know that its body is going to be put in a good place. It's going to be called home. So you always had to be careful what you talked about, even when it comes to other types of hunting. Seal hunting, for example, was really important all year round because seals were a very main dietary food for the Iñupiat people. You can't hunt the seal unless you were going to hunt to eat it. You can't just kill it for its fur. You can't kill it for certain parts of its body. It was going to be used all together. Polar bears, they were really revered. Polar bears are wanderers of the north. They can come into your community and cause havoc. But then again, they can also be very genuinely observable to where you can learn from them. They can teach you how to look for seal pups deading underneath the snow. They can teach you how to find seal breathing holes that are buried above the snow. They can teach you many things. So you could always be careful how you talk about things and not talk about them in boastful manners or bragging ways. Otherwise, you will bring bad luck to yourself, per se. So yes, like how you must have heard in the southeast or in the southwest about how things were told, you gotta be careful how you talk about things. Like in the wintertime, the Northern Lights, they were kind of like a curfew notice for the children that played out long time. They always said, if you guys are going to play out past a certain hour in the evening, be careful of the Northern Lights, for when they start to get real colorful, they'll start to come down, and when they get low enough and you are unaware, they'll actually chop their head off and bring it back up there and play kickball with it. You know, and that's was an indication to the kids long time ago that it was time to go home, you know, and go to bed.
It's also the super secret way parents get their kids to be quiet at night.
Because I remember, I must have been about 5 or 6 years old, and if I wanted to play out a little bit longer, my mom and them would say, "Yep, can you kid, and chop off your head." I would start immediately ducking below my waist and running home like this. Or if I had a hood over my jacket, I'd put my hood over my head, and I'd literally almost be crying just running home, just thinking that the Northern Lights were really going to come down and take my head off and stuff like that. They talked about little people too, Iñupiat. At a certain time, they always said, don't go wandering off farther than you should be going when you're a little kid, because there are little people out there that might snatch you and take you away as hostage. They might either kill you or they might use you. And, you know, you like gnomes and leprechauns, but we call them Iñupiat, little people. They were no bigger than, some say, 12 to 14 inches. But they were strong enough to carry caribou over their shoulders for many yards or miles.
Trolls.
Actually, that reminds me of the story about how the first people were created. Humans were actually the third type of people. First it was the tall people, then it was the Inuit, and then it was us.
They call them the Tununit. There was a people that lived up here before the Bernic times. The word Bernic is really derived from the word Bernic. Shooting station is what we call it in English. They were a real big people. They were so big that they can actually haul in a walrus by themselves, when it would take several people to haul one, walrus up onto the ice from the ocean.
They were scared of other people, so they run away real fast.
Yeah.
Archaeologists have actually started to find evidence of shorter races of early humans and stuff like that.
You see the old whaling station over here, we call the Maddie's Cafe, or where Charles Brower had his first shop. Long time ago, I don't know, maybe erosion has already taken it away, but long before they even established a trading post there, when the people of Nuvuk used to live at the point, there was a small settlement that lived here, and they lived in small sod houses, no bigger than dog houses, all over that place, and they called it the place of Iminyaroks. I don't know if they were dwarves, midgets, or trolls, but they were little people. And there's a story of a family, a man and a woman and their children. They were Iminyarok people, and they were invited to the village of Nuvuk. And while the father and the mother were inside of the adult Inuit living in their sod house, eating and talking away, the Iminyarok little child was outside playing near the big people's dogs where they tied them up. And dogs back then, they were not, tame. They were vicious dogs. They were just made for pulling and stuff like that. So this little child, Iminyarok, got so close to one of the dogs that the dog actually snatched it, and just without even mangling it up or anything, it just swallowed it whole. And the father of the child, Iminyarok, came out of the igloo, and they're so strong that father actually grabbed the tail of that dog and started whiplashing it like this until he killed the dog. And then he got his knife and he slit open its stomach and tried to find his child. But the child had already been swollen or swallowed, and it would already died. And the Iminyarok family was devastated, and they took their child out from inside of that dog's body, and they cursed the Inuit, saying, "This is it, no more. From this day on, we're going to leave you. We're going to go away from here. You guys will never ever see us again." And the story is that they moved somewhere west, like toward the Beard Mountains, somewhere in the northwest of Alaska. They say they still exist to this day, but they have this, they don't want to get in contact with the people anymore. They don't want people to know of their existence. They don't want people to know where they are, where they live, or what they do anymore. But they say they really exist. It's a really good story. I don't know. The morals of these stories is they teach you something when you listen to them. They have some kind of lesson that needs to be learned. Like whaling, I just described that. Hunting, you can't just hunt ducks because they're easy to catch. You have to be careful when you're hunting ducks. You gotta hunt so much or so many, only enough to feed your family and the people that can't feed themselves. If you catch one too many and you just leave them there to rot, then your hunting successes will be limited in the days to come. There's always a lesson to be learned when you're listening to stories. There's always a catch to it.
All right, thanks.
Okay.
Guys, any other